Mungo Park finds himself destitute, starving, and writing Safes to survive. As Parks puts it, Safes are, quote, prayers or rather sentences from the Quran which the Mohammedan priests write on scraps of paper and sell to the simple natives who consider them to possess very extraordinary virtues, end quote. Arriving at the market town of Kulakoro, Park finds food and lodging with an unnamed Bambaran man in exchange for writing a Safi. The man, according to Park, possessed a superstitious confidence and immediately fetched his writing board which could protect him from wicked men. Park continues, quote, the proposal was of too great consequence to me to be refused. I therefore wrote the board full from top to bottom on both sides. And my landlord, to be certain of having the whole force of the charm, washed the writing from the board into a calabash with a little water. And, having said a few prayers over it, drank this powerful draught, after which, lest a single word should escape, he licked the board until it was quite dry. End quote. The Bambaran man's actions, his bodily absorption of Park's written text, does not draw further comment from our narrator. However, the act is latently delegitimized through the suggestion of his superstitious nature, as well as Park's preceding comment that, quote, natives consider the art of writing as bordering on magic, and it is in the arts of the magician that their confidence is placed. Here, Park's narrative restraint eschews outright moral judgment in favor of a critical relativism that remains anchored in European legitimacy. He creates a microcosmic great divide between the European narrator's reading public and the Bambaran man, whereby the latter appears to be in awe of the former's mastery of reading and the written word. And so I refer there to obviously to the great divide theory between print and orality being a so-called primitive precursor to print. Park's apparent objectivity is clearly strategic, even feigned, and forms part of what Mary Louise Pratt has famously called the narrative of colonial anti-conquest. However, we might venture to disrupt Park's narrative of anti-conquest through a closer and indeed more playful reading. In reconsidering the actions of the Bambaran man, for example, we could even identify the Platonic idealist position of writing as non-truth, whereby it sows forgetfulness in the soul and turns us towards the inanimate and towards non-knowledge. By swallowing the text and licking his writing board dry, the Bambaran man substitutes the gnomic device for a living memory. Or to draw on Derrida's discussion of Plato and orality in dissemination, he forsakes prosthesis for the organ, returning the written text to the body so that knowledge might actively be reanimated again. Yet this form of analysis is to subordinate the mediated representation of an indigenous subject to Western modes of theoretical discourse and Greek metaphysics, highlighting a recurrent problem that arises when scholars attempt to reclaim indigenous agency and knowledge from within the colonial archive. Specifically, there is often a desire to legitimize subjects through Western ways of knowing, which in turn reinforces colonial epistemologies. How do we navigate this? In what ways can we disrupt Eurocentric norms of objectivity and knowledge in the colonial archive and texts without risking further appropriation and misrepresentation? This paper hopes to explore some possibilities and also problems. Park's travels in the interior districts of Africa is a travel narrative which abounds in descriptions of quote-unquote jalakias, singing men, and other examples of Mande oral culture. These representations are inherently complex and problematic given Park's mission and resulting publication were so integral to British colonial expansion in West Africa. Yet the engagement with oral culture, and in particular griots, is recurrent and atypically detailed as scholars working on griot epics have previously noted. At one point, Park describes how the poets of Africa are, quote, in great measure exempted from the neglect and indigence which, in more polished countries, commonly attend the votaries of the muses. Evoking an almost oceanic conception of Scotland's ancient bards, Park describes how the noble, sorry, that's my doorbell, which I'm going to ignore, the joys of Zoom at home. So where was I? Yeah, at one point, Park describes how the poets of Africa are, quote, in great measure exempted from the neglect and indigence which in more polis countries commonly attend the votaries of the muses. Evoking an almost oceanic conception of Scotland's ancient bards, Park describes how the noblest part of the singing men's work is to, quote, recite the historical events of their country, hence in war they accompany soldiers to the field to awaken in them a spirit of glorious emulation. Here, it seems Park's subaltern subjectivity of the great figure is mediated by his search for a quote-unquote authenticity that was lamentably under threat in his homeland, which was Scotland, by the way, but remained available in the present quote-unquote primitive state of West Africa. And I just want to briefly note here that in the longer version of this paper, I suggest that this subaltern subjectivity and Park's apparent infatuation with orality might partly be explained by situating his text as a typically Scottish romantic one, which looked to the colonial horizon in search of oral so-called authenticity at a time when Burns and Scott were undertaking similar projects closer to home. However, in the interest of the time I have left today, I want to focus on attempting a decolonial reading of these representations by locating indigenous knowledge in Park's text by means of what Njoki Wayne calls epistemic resistance. Wayne uses this term to describe her engagement with transformative ways of knowing within the Western Academy, a place that has had no space for African indigenous knowledges, and the space that has actively worked to marginalize and degrade these ways of knowing. The following analysis demonstrates to some extent how we might consider these representations to both engage and disrupt Eurocentric ways of seeing, as demonstrated briefly by my opening example of the unnamed Bambaran man. Drawing further on this specific incident, I consider orality in the context of a non-European way of thinking about language, demonstrating the possible merits, but also problems of embracing a critical lineage which lies outside the bounds of Greco-Roman or Eurocentric thought. In particular, I examine conceptions of Nyama, which is Mande in origin, as they relate to orality, language, and correspond to aspects of Park's narrative. But I'm also eager to stress here that my own knowledge of Mande culture, and specifically Nyama, is limited and indeed predominantly informed by African studies scholarship, which itself can be detached and secondary to the cultural space, place, people, and traditions that forms its subject. There is an inherent risk then of appropriation and the recentering of power relations in this form of literary analysis. Yet equally, when re-examining colonial representations of Mande orality in this particular text, it does not seem appropriate nor just to ignore or neglect knowledges which better inform our understanding of such subaltern subjectivity. Decolonization requires us to deconstruct colonial ways of coming to know, as well as construct, suggest, or even point to alternatives. And with a future emphasis on further collaboration with scholars working in the region and the cultures under consideration, I hope that highlighting some of these multiple ways of knowing can bear fruit for critical thought in our respective locales. So I'm going to attempt to introduce the Mande concept of Nyama, specifically as it relates to language, identity, and orality in Mande society, and subsequently Park's texts. And again, I'm highlighting and stressing here my own limitations and also the layered and limited nature of drawing on knowledge from afar and indeed in mediated in academic publications. However, just beginning to trace a lineage here, I think, can help us to locate complex presences of indigenous being in Park's text that otherwise remain potentially unseen. So the term Nyama derives from the Nyamakala, a professional class of artists and other occupationally defined specialists among the Mande-speaking peoples of West Africa, including griots, blacksmiths, and leather workers. In their essay, Etymologies of Nyamakala, it's noted that etymologies are usually divided into two constituents, and that people who know how to deal with this force of nature, people who know how to deal with this force of nature, who know how to handle nyama as one would handle a tool, are nyama handlers. Bards, leatherworkers, and blacksmiths handle nyama, hence they're called nyama kala. The idea that bards or griots have a tool in orality which is infused with nyama is important to consider, particularly since the concept has often been overlooked in major and Western studies of print and orality. However, it's admittedly difficult to discuss nyama in this context of speech and writing without subordinating it again to Greek metaphysics. As Christopher Wise notes, generic definitions have often taken precedence over matters of the occult, whereby critics usually resort to Platonic idealism or Aristotelian logic. Wise's intervention is to propose that nyama might be construed as a force generated of both these complexes and more. Although attempting to veer from a strictly Western critical lineage, Wise's conception of nyama appears to evoke the anti-humanism of post-structuralist theory in its assertion of the psyche as, quote, blowing wind before it becomes mind. Moreover, the idea that nyama, and in the griot's case, we might say specifically language, can destroy those who wield it, also bring to mind Derrida's notion of writing as a pharmacon, which acts as both remedy and poison. This is a particularly relevant illusion since the nyama kala have historically been associated with tasks involving poison, as well as being known as masters of medicine and language. The point of these relational comparisons between Mande thought and deconstruction is not to stake a claim for the quote-unquote modernity or theoretical depth of pre-Platonic Mande thought, but rather to untangle the knots of Park's representations of orality, and in doing so offer a fresh reading. When considering the Bambaran man's bodily absorption of text, for example, we can veer from subordinating the incident entirely to Greek metaphysics and work to include considerations of nyama. For the nyama kala, there is no world, no ideas, which are not first a matter of bodily spirit, and thus the Bambaran man returns the text inside the blood-filled body. This reading takes on further resonances when considering nyama in relation to bodily fluids. Charles Montiel calls nyama a fluid common to all nature, while Yusuf Cissé describes it as meaning life spirit or endowed with animated spirit, a flux that obeys the will of the soul. In another etymology, Boker and Jai writes that it means manure, filth, or feces, the world's energy and material return to the body to be regurgitated again. The concept of nyama is then also an occult materialism of the body, and so it seems less surprising that the Bambaran man swallows text to vitalize its power. And this context also provides possible insurgent ways of reading other parts of Park's text, such as, quote, when the religious opinions of the pagan natives are addressed. In describing the conclusion of a short prayer, which is recited at new moon, Park describes how they, quote, spit upon their hands and rub them over their faces before reducing this act to Christian analogy. However, in considering a different and indeed previously repressed knowledge system or critical lineage, an alternative reading is made possible, particularly when considering how the saliva of the nyama kala is believed to possess curative properties because it's infused with nyama. So to move towards a close, then, if Mungo Park refracts Mande society and specifically orality through his own imperial eyes and Greco-Christian knowledge base, then decolonial scholarship should offer alternative ways of seeing, while also acknowledging that the gaze of imperial eyes cannot be unseen, and even well-meaning scholarship can be a repeated form of subordination, which I remain very wary of. However, to repeat my previous point, part of decolonizing literary studies requires us to both deconstruct colonial ways of coming to know, as well as constructing possible alternatives. And this reading of orality in Park's text speaks to some of the broader possibilities and also problems of decolonial critical thought, particularly in the study of romantic texts and the colonial archive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was really, really great. Arun, really interesting paper.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so yeah, I think, and I've got lots of questions already for both speakers, and I think you're raising really interesting points. Very fascinating. Thank you so much. Now we're moving, because we're running a bit late, so we are moving to the last presenter. We've got Holly May Treadwell, Holly is a doctoral candidate in English literature at the University of Kent. Her current research focuses on the representation of Indigenous peoples in American comics. The other research interests include postcolonial theory, feminist theory, comic studies, queer theory, and animal studies. She's especially interested in the ways in which the comics medium can provide a platform to redraw and to challenge existing narratives of people, places, and events. She has presented at the International Graphic Novel and Comics Conference in 2019 and is presenting at the BRISMES conference this year and the Feminist Theories Workshop at Duke, for which she won an International Travel Award. She has a paper on sex and gender in Native America coming out in Brief Encounters in the spring. Now, today she's going to talk about Ciro Guerra's film, and it's a really interesting analysis of the story of Karmakate, the last surviving member of the Kuyana people who were eradicated in the rubber Holocaust. So she'll be explaining a bit more around the question of the Capitalism, which describes our current epoch. So it's also her framework of analysis. Holly will say a bit more about this in her presentation. Now, over to you, Holly, and looking forward to listening to this great and very interesting presentation.
Hello, yes, thank you very much for that introduction. Yeah, so as you said, today I'm going to be talking about the topic of extinction in Ciro Guerra's film, Embrace of the Serpent, looking at capitalism's erasure of people, culture, and nature. Yeah, as Chiara, you mentioned, the concept behind the paper is the Capitalism, which I'll summarize just briefly for those who are unfamiliar with it. So the Anthropocene, which is kind of the generally accepted term for a current epoch, claims that it is the activity of humans as a whole that are having such detrimental effects on the environment. And this kind of view fits very comfortably with a view of population, environment, and history governed by food and resource use, and very much abstracted from class and empire. The Capitalism, on the other hand, claims it's not merely human activity, but the activities of capitalism specifically. So it focuses on the role of big industry and recognizing that just 20 of the biggest companies continue to emit 1/3 of all carbon emissions, whilst the working class are denigrated for using plastic straws. So Jason Moore, who's a kind of central theorist on the topic, states that global warming is capital's crowning achievement. Accumulation by extinction has been fundamental to capitalism from the beginning. The accumulation of capital is the accumulation of potential extinction, a potential increasingly activated in recent decades. The central victims of this extinction are the subaltern colonial subjects of this regime. Indeed, the dangers and challenges that threatened and still haunt the communities of the Amazon, such as death, dispossession, exploitation, destruction of their habitat, and acculturation, are explored by Ciro Guerra's Embrace of the Serpent, which follows the story of Karmakate, who, as Chiara pointed out, is the last surviving member of the Cohiwano, who were eradicated during the rubber Holocaust. The film demonstrates how capitalism leaves in its wake the disappearance of species, languages, cultures, and people, and how this extinction is no accident, but is achieved through labor, murder, deforestation, depletion of resources, and dispossession, all in the name of progress. So the first form of extinction, oh, why is my slideshow not working? There we go. So the first form of extinction the film explores is the extinction of indigenous peoples as a direct result of capitalist exploitation, specifically in regards to the rubber trade and the indigenous slave trade. So in one scene, the audience is shown the scars on Manduka's back in figure 1, which Karmakate immediately recognizes as having been inflicted by the rubber barons. This instant recognition reveals the prominence of plantations where the barons brutally subjected the indigenous peoples to forced labor. This kind of brutality is emphasized further by the mutilated local the travelers come across, who has only one arm, he's got serious facial scarring, a limp, and an improvised kind of splint on his leg. The man in question begs Manduka to kill him. The others protest, but Manduka explains that if I don't kill him, they'll torture him to death. Nobody deserves this hell, emphasizing the horrors of the plantations by suggesting that death is preferable to being a slave there. Furthermore, Manduka's knowledge of the man's fate suggests that it is a common one among the slaves. Indeed, they were either murdered or died because of the cruel treatment they received from the rubber barons. This suffering and death can be seen to be a direct result of capitalism's drive for profit, as the native people were forced to extract the latex. If they did not deliver the fees demanded by the rubber tappers, they were punished in the stocks, flogged and tortured, and even when they did deliver, they were simply given certain goods at exorbitant prices. So here we can see how the native peoples were forced to participate in the colonial economy as well as being the generators of it. So the film also demonstrates how the decimation of land in favour of the rubber plantations contributes to the extinction of people through Theo's malaria. So the demand for rubber caused the homogenization of areas whose native diversity was destroyed and replaced by a few staple crops, such as sugar, tobacco, coffee, and in this particular case, latex, which were almost entirely luxury exports to the West and of no use to the locals. So this lack of ecological diversity in favour of profit allowed for malaria and yellow fever to thrive to new epidemic proportions, showing how capitalism in the form of the exploitation of nature indirectly leads to the extinction of indigenous populations. Another means of extinction presented by the film is direct murder, as Karamakati himself is the last survivor of an indigenous tribe eradicated during armed conflict over the region's rubber. The genocide committed by the white Colombians seeking to commodify the rubber trees is emphasized hauntingly when the travelers stumble upon a mass grave and bodies hanging from trees at rubber plantations, as in figures 5 and 6. This genocide was not a rare occurrence during the rubber boom of the early 20th century and is part of what is referred to as the rubber holocaust. Embrace of the Serpent also demonstrates how capitalism causes the extinction of native culture, specifically their harmonious relationship with nature, by contrasting the indigenous people's respect and understanding of the environment to the colonizers' ignorance and disrespect of it. So the film demonstrates the former relationship, firstly through the personification of the environment. So nature itself is presented as a character in the narrative, as shots like those in figures 7 and 8 are often from the perspective of the river looking up onto the shores. So in the first one there, Karamakati is observed from bottom to top at the very beginning of the film, appearing to record the perspective of a person or an animal from the water, but there is no such person. It's the river itself that observes him. So Guerra uses this camera angle to depict nature as a living being that can observe and potentially react, thus rejecting capitalist view of it merely as a passive commodity. Furthermore, Karamakati states that the jungle is fragile, and if you attack her, she strikes back. She will only allow us to travel if we respect her. The pronoun she and the concept of respect and the necessity of her permission personify the environment and give it autonomy, implying that the indigenous locals view nature as their equal and their relationship is one of respectful coexistence. Sorry, my sound's going a bit weird. I'm going to ignore those. So the film also presents Karamakati's harmony with and understanding of the environment, especially in the scene where he is surrounded by butterflies. So their proximity, volume, and the calmness of all parties is kind of the perfect example of humans' capacity to merge with nature's rhythms and patterns intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. So the use of butterflies in particular also emphasizes this connection. Firstly, butterflies are generally solitary creatures, which is reflective of Karamakati as the last surviving member of his tribe. But some butterflies, for example, the Coleadinae family, often spend time in groups near bodies of water, especially rivers, which is where we find Karamakati and his travel companions throughout the film. Moreover, many butterflies use these bodies of water, specifically rivers, again, to traverse their migratory routes, just as Karamakati and his fellow travellers follow the river to lead them to the Akruna plant in both journeys. In addition, many types of butterflies have been shown to retain their memories and knowledge from when they were caterpillars, even despite the extreme metamorphosis they undergo in the cocoon. This fact can also be paralleled to Karamakati, who, despite the complete transformation of his country, the forest, and many tribes people's ways of life, Karamakati holds on to his culture, refuses to assimilate, and does his best to keep to his traditional practices. In addition, the use of butterflies could also indicate Karamakati's deep understanding of the forest by referencing the butterfly effect, which claims that a butterfly flaps its wings in China and sets off a tornado in Texas, drawing on the ways in which small events compound and irreversibly alter the future of the universe. This concept is particularly evident in nature, and Ibanez and her co-writers outline one way in which an action can cause a series of negative effects, as economic activities such as extraction and cultivation affect the regeneration of the vegetation and the climate in general, which affects the water system. So the lack of vegetation causes erosion, which in turn results in a greater load of sediment in rivers, water turbidity, and geomorphological changes that influence aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, and consequently plant and animal diversity. This scene then appears to gesture towards Karamakati's awareness of these potential knock-on effects, and this is confirmed through his forest rules, as he states that they must not eat meat or fish until the rains begin, and we must ask permission to the owners of animals. We can't cut any tree from its root. The idea that they must ask permission connotes the necessity of consent, which further endows a sense of autonomy to nature, as the very setting of rules of behavior implies an understanding of the jungle as an earth being. Furthermore, the Cohiwano's rules for interacting with nature infer that their relationship, like many indigenous silvical practices, is based on sustainable and renewable maximization of all the diverse forms and functions of forests and trees. They try to maintain their harmony and comply with certain rules that over the years they have determined are necessary for everything to continue to flow harmoniously. Therefore, the rules are based on acquired knowledge and experience. So the ban on eating meat or fish before the rains ensures that they do not destroy the populations of animals who are already struggling during the dry season. These rules then display a deep understanding of the way in which the smallest action can have a large impact on the environment. This kinship and the significance of the butterfly as a symbol of change and cultural retention is emphasized by the dream sequence towards the end of the film, which finishes on the image of a human figure drawn inside a butterfly, acting as a visual representation of the interconnectedness between the activities of humans and nature. So Embrace of the Serpent also goes on to demonstrate how this relationship based on understanding and respect is destroyed by the invasion of capitalism and their personification replaced by commodification and even demonization of nature. The film first does this through the presentation of the non-natives' disregard for Karamakati's prohibitions, both in the Christian mission, where the travellers are offered fish for dinner, and when Theo deliriously protests the rules, shouting, "Permission from whom? You, the owner of the fishes. I'm sick because of respecting your ridiculous prohibitions. This river is full of fish. One less won't change anything." The derogatory and mocking tone here indicates his complete disrespect that him and the other colonists have for indigenous cultures, as well as their complete lack of understanding of nature itself. Theo's claim that one less fish won't make a difference reveals his disregard for the importance of each and every life, as well as his ignorance of the dramatic effects the smallest of actions can have, that is, the jungle's fragility that Karamakati warned of earlier in the film. So Karamakati states that white people are ants. They'll eat anything and die fat. They'll devour everything. So ants appear as a pretty apt metaphor for colonizers here, as they occupy virtually all major terrestrial habitats and are known as an invasive species. Moreover, Karamakati's in-depth knowledge of nature would tell him that ants hoard food and are often destructive to the environment that they're found in. So the film could be also referring to capitalism's tendency to destroy long-term survival in favor of short-term profit in the shape of mass extraction and consumption. I'm coming towards the end, I promise. So these contrasting attitudes to the environment are also well established through the references to serpents in the film. So the name of the film comes from the Mayan creation story, which describes how the celestial anaconda brought the humans to Earth, created nature, and its embrace signifies the communication between people and the environment. In contrast, by turning to Christian stories, such as the one of Adam and Eve, it becomes clear that Christianity associates serpents, and by extension nature itself, with evil and corruption, indicating how their beliefs shape and define their differing relationships with nature. Okay, very last point is about the Icruna plant in the extinction of indigenous culture itself. So the tribe's sacred traditions state that Icruna must not be cultivated, demonstrating their understanding of the pejorative biological effects of cultivation. What is known as green revolution agriculture actually decreases genetic diversity, inhibits their medicine value, and increases the vulnerability of plants to diseases, and therefore extinction. This extinction is also referenced by the plant's supposed caretakers, who have given up protecting it from capitalist development, have been reduced to drunks, and are shown toasting the end of the world. The camera here alternates between shots of the sacred plant being cultivated and the caretakers toasting, indicating the connection between the two. So whilst the tribespeople see Icruna as ecologically valuable, the Western colonizers merely want it for its exploitable properties, specifically its ability to increase the purity of rubber. The film thus demonstrates how capitalism values only commercially useful nature, and how this view leads to the felling of forests full of trees that maintain the life of the soil and water and of the local people, but do not generate profit, so are viewed as weeds and an obstruction to agriculture. So Guetta's embrace of the serpent can be seen to show how capitalism causes the extinction of indigenous people, culture, and nature itself. By depicting this extinction, the film brings to light the songs of many tribes who have suffered from the effects of capitalist greed and will continue to be the prime victims of the capitalistine. The film demonstrates the claim that some activities that man has carried out in these lands have brought and continue to bring negative impacts on indigenous ecosystems and natural resources. Economic activities, especially extractive activities, although they have generated wealth for some, have been negative for both their inhabitants and the environment. The film's presentation of this story from the perspective of a native shaman, as indicated by the frequent positioning of the camera looking over Karamakati's shoulder, attempts to combat to some degree the erasure of these stories and the ignorance of the disastrous effects that are already damaging and destroying native communities. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks, it was really brilliant. Thanks to all of you. Really fascinating discussions and presentations. Thanks. So we'll now open it to the audience, and we are looking forward to hearing your questions. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box, or you can simply turn your